What's going on, guys? Welcome back to TheTranq. Today I'm going to be making a really nice bird's eye maple and purple heart jewelry box. I've got some nice wood and I just want to make a really nice box with it. Going to take our time and pay attention to detail and make it the best we can. So let's go ahead, guys, and dive into the video. Okay, so this build starts off with the track saw. So I'm using a piece of bird's eye maple that's a little over 3/4 inches thick, and it had two rough edges on it. So I decided instead of jointing one flat by hand, I would just use the track saw to put a straight edge on it, which worked out really well. And then using that straight edge, I could then cut these into the rough widths that I was going to be using for the box. Once they're into their rough widths, I can start planing them to get a face flat. I like to do this by hand instead of using the jointer because I seem to have better success doing it by hand, and it's also enjoyable. Once I have it to the point where one face has no twist or wobble or anything like that, I can then run it through the planer to get the opposite face parallel. You got to take really light passes with this. It'll easily chip out the little bird's eye knots if you don't have a helical blade. So straight knives, you have to be real careful, take really light passes, and despite doing that, I still got quite a bit of tear out with the planer, so I had to do quite a bit of cleanup by hand in order to get a nice smooth finish. And you can see after a considerable amount of planing, I've got a nice glass smooth surface with perfect tear out free bird's eyes. Okay, so with the rough milling done, I can then start to get these cut more accurately to their size. I'm going to be using rabbets as the joinery on this, but despite that, I'm still going to go for a continuous grain look. And so I cut side end here, just using the previous piece to reference the new dimension. And you don't have to get these perfect at this point because I'll be squaring them out with the shooting plane after. And so then I go over to the shooting board and start squaring up those edges. I start with the end grain, and this is pretty tough to plane, especially with this bird's eye maple being a hard maple. So you need a real sharp blade, and I still get a little more resistance than I'd like, but I'm trying to improve that. Once I have one end square, then I can do the corresponding edge as well. And doing that is really essential to get these pieces identical in size. It's going to clean up the final look of the box considerably. So I then get the thickness of the pieces with the marking gauge and transfer those to the edges in order to see where I'm going to be cutting these rabbets. So I'll be roughing out the rabbets at the table saw. This is a quick way to get away with the majority of the material, but if you just leave it at the table saw, even with a flat ground blade like what I'm using, you'll find that you have a slightly wavy joint surface, and that's really just not going to cut it for the kind of accuracy and precision that we're going for. And so I leave it about a 32nd or 64th shy of where I want to be on the depth of that rabbet, and I clean that up with the Veritas rabbet plane. So I essentially just keep taking passes with the rabbet plane until I meet the shoulder line that was established with the marking gauge. And so I just carefully take pass by pass and double check every time until I reach that point. Now you can't see exactly in the video, but it's a glass smooth surface there on the rabbet, which is just something you cannot obtain with power tools. I just had a tiny little ridge in the corner, probably because I just slightly underset the fence of the rabbet plane. So I just came in with a large chisel and just cleaned up that little nub to make sure the joint sits flush. So with the joinery finished for the outside, I could start milling the lumber for both the lid and the drawer bottom, or box bottom. I'm using purple heart for the lid. You're going to see that the purple heart and bird's eye maple make just a beautiful combo. And then just to kind of complement the theme, I'm going with yellow heart for the bottom because, I really enjoy using hardwoods for the bottom instead of plywood now. And additionally, I think it's cool to have purple heart and yellow heart on the same project. So I clean up this little piece of 1/4 inch yellow heart by hand and get a nice smooth surface on both sides. It's already relatively at the thickness I want it, so I don't have to send it any more through the planer. With the yellow heart prepared, I can go back to the table saw and start putting in the small dado for the box bottom. I'm going to leave the dado slightly undersized to the thickness of the yellow heart because I'll be dialing in that fit by hand as well. But I do cut the yellow heart to the dimensions I need for the bottom. And you have to be really careful here because on the, I guess, side-to-side portion of the piece, you know that it's going to expand and contract. And so you want to account for that, leaving maybe a 32nd of an inch for that to occur yearly. And so you want to undercut that one a little bit, but you want the length, because that's going to be constant, to be, you know, right up to your joint. And so you just want to be careful when you're marking and measuring that. And so this is where I dial in that box bottom fit by hand. And so, as I was saying, those dados are just slightly undersized. And so what I do is take off a shaving off the entire face here of the yellow heart, and then check that fit. And I continue to do the same process until that just perfectly fits. And a good tight fit there is going to really help with glue up. And so it's worth the time to take your time and dial this in. I save the wood shavings from plating because they make great tinder down the road. And before glue up, I could finish the inside of the box, as this will be difficult to get to later. Again, this bird's eye maple does present a bit more resistance to planing than some woods, but as long as your blade is sharp, you should be able to do it. And then I tape off those joints where I don't want to get any finish on, and put a piece of rope through the dado and go ahead and put a coat or two of the spray lacquer on. So then it was on to glue up here, which is relatively straightforward and stress-free for a project like this. But you want to make sure you have glue in there to, you know, enough glue to get a good strong joint. But I also wax the edges where I don't want glue with paste wax in order to make sure that any squeeze out is easily cleaned up and doesn't remain permanent on the workpiece. So once that, you can see that click from the box bottom fitting so snugly is kind of what we're going for. Just helps everything stay together better, and then I can come in with clamps and make sure that everything is really tight and clamped together. Now, before doing the finishing work on the box, I can give my plane blade a quick sharpen here. I sharpen freehand now, following Rob Cosman's technique, and it works great for me, and it's really fast, and honestly, it's not that difficult. So if you're worried about trying it, just remember it's easy enough to fix a plane blade bevel if you need to, but it's worth giving it a shot by hand and see if you can get the technique down. So before planing those joints, I want to remove any glue with a chisel, just because I find it's a little easier to take that any major glue squeeze out with a chisel. I can then carefully come in and just plane those joints until they're perfectly flush. And this is another benefit of hand tools, is sanding, you're just not going to get this type of precision that you can get with a hand plane, and it's really satisfying to see the fit come together. Now, I left the two sides of the box a little bit proud of the ends, and that was on purpose, so that after the glue up I could just flatten down or take material off two edges to get everything hopefully flat and save myself a little bit of planing. Once I had that flat, I could finally cut the box top into its final dimension here, or close to its final dimension. You can see this purple heart had a bit of twist in it where it's knocking off material off the two corners there. So again, doing this on a jointer is actually quite difficult, and so I find it easier to take care of any sort of major deformations by hand and then run it through the planer. I just find that to be the easiest way to do this. So I left this piece a little bit oversized so that I could dial in the box fit with my hand plane and shooting board. So here I'm bringing in the width into exactly where I need it. And after a lot more work than you just saw there, you can see I have a perfect fit here with no shadow gap between the box and the top. And this is the exact kind of precision we're going for, but you do have to put the time in to get to that point. Now I'm trying a new technique for a little finger pull that I saw Rob Cosman show, and essentially use a sanding drum on your drill press and just put your box in at a diagonal to make this really cool finger pull cutout that looks a lot trickier to do than it is, and it ends up very symmetric and very nice. I just had to clean up a slight bit of burning with the card scraper, again because the card scraper removes a lot more material and you can get rid of those burn marks a lot quicker than by sanding. Here you can see how that looks, and it's looking really awesome at this point. So as usual, I'm going to be going with Brusso hinges here. They're solid brass and a lot heavier, and the leaves are nice and thick so that you can get a perfect fit between the lid and the box. And so I carefully start laying out those hinges by hand here. You want to make sure this layout is really high precision because, if anything's slightly off here, your box, which is now perfectly fitted to or your lid, which is now perfectly fitted to the box, will not sit right if you don't put these hinges in correctly. So I recommend Matt Eslia's video on how to install these. He really goes over a great technique on how to do it, and it's the exact way I've practiced and implemented my projects. So the first step to that technique is to start splitting up the fibers slightly by a bit of chopping motion. And so essentially what you're doing here is chopping, breaking things up a little bit away from the marking lines so that it's easier to pare away material without splitting. So you can see once you have those chopped up, you can come and just carefully sneak up those fibers to start taking away material. And again, you never want to break fibers off, you always want to sever them. That'll ensure that things are disconnecting exactly where you want them to. And it's a tedious process, but it's very relaxing and enjoyable, and I just take my time with it. So here you can see the hinges on the box, and they are sitting in there flush and very nicely. And with those done, I could move on to the corresponding mortises on the lid. And this is essentially the same process. One thing you can see I do is I put a backer piece of oak there that's nice and thick. That's just going to help support the piece of Purple Heart while I'm doing the pairing step right here. You can see I also put a little piece of leather there because at this point this fit's dialed in. I don't want to mar any of the surfaces. And once you have all the material moved away, you can do that final chop right up to your marking line and just remove that tiny bit of material just like that to finish the mortise off. You know you've done this correctly when the hinges sit in there without any screws and they're sitting there tight and flush. Okay, so now to transfer the holes, I'm actually using a cool new little Starrit center marking tool, which is a very precise little tool. It allows you to mark those centered holes perfectly for the hinges. And once they're marked, I take them over to the drill press and drill them out. Guys, if you are looking for good hearing protection and tunes in the shop, be sure to check out IsoTunes Audio. You can get 10% off using my discount in the description below. It helps them out, it helps me out, and it's a great company, and I use their products all the time. Okay, so with those holes drilled out, I can attach the hinges here and do any final fitting of the lid. You can see here that I just had a slight bit of proud on the right side of the lid here, and so I just use my block plane to bring that in flush. And once the lid is completely finished, I bring it over to the router table where I do, it's sort of an OG profile. It's sort of a modified OG, but it's a very elegant design. You'll see it in a second. And I just carefully run that through the router table to put that profile on. At this point, you can't touch the edges of the box lid because it's already fitted, but you can take off material to smooth the top off. So I come through and plane the top to get it nice and glossy smooth for the finish. And I use a couple of those feathers from planing to help sand and burnish that profile from the router. Finally, it's on to the very finishing touches here. So I'm using my block plane here to just put a slight chamfer on the edges here. Normally I go for a zero shadow gap, zero reveal look, but there was one slight misalignment on the back side of this box. I still don't really know how it popped up, but in order to disguise that, if you chamfer the edges, it basically looks like you meant to put a slight shadow line in there. So it's a really good method, and as long as you put a clean chamfer on, it looks really good. Okay, so for the finish, I'm using Deft Spray Lacquer. It's a really good lacquer, and it's quick to apply, and it's easy to apply, and it leaves a glass smooth finish. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to try it out. It's a really easy finish. I'd recommend it. But I ended up going with 4 coats total of the lacquer on the box and the lid here, and I sanded it about 600 grit between coats just to get a nice smooth surface. With that, I could put on my marker and enjoy some final views of the shots. Alright, that's going to do it for today's video, guys. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. There's really minimal mistakes on the box. It turned out really beautiful. It's glass smooth with that nice lacquer on it, and the bird's eye maple and the purple heart just really pop to make a gorgeous box. So if you enjoyed this, guys, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment below if you liked it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.